This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie, and I understand this week you have not a T-shirt, but a blockbuster live event to spruik.
If you can believe it, my remit covers marketing and extortion activities beyond the realm of T-shirts.
What?
Yeah, I know. And just to prove that point, the fabulous folks at Currently Speaking have agreed to partner with Team LMSU to deliver an electrifying blockbuster crossover event, which we're currently coining Chaos Trivia. Is that right?
Yeah, no, we're totally going with Chaos Trivia.
Yeah.
The first idea is the best idea, Frankie.
Yeah, okay, fair. And what do you folks need to know about it? Well, we're doing it on the first evening of the All Energy Conference down in Melbourne. It'll be at a bar. And it turns out there'll also be some entertainment. We are going to be joined.
Even more entertainment, Frankie, is what you meant to say.
Even more. Oh, that's right.
Not just the luminaries from Currently Speaking, not just the co-host of the Let Me Sum Up podcast, but also...
There's more?
I mean, we don't play instruments, so I guess I was referring to entertainment in the classical sense. Being the fine folks of the Nemchat singers who have agreed to join this crazy whatever this is going to be. It's going to be fun, though. I can guarantee that. And what else are we doing? So we're putting on, well, there'll be drinks, there'll be food, there'll be trivia. There may well be some role play if Tennant gets his way on various things. And I think you'll have to pay $30, something like that, for a ticket. Not too much for any professionals heading along to All Energy or banging around Melbourne. But all profits will be donated to the First Nations Clean Energy Network, which is a great outfit, and we'd love to support them on the way through. So I think if this all piques your fancy, and if it doesn't, frankly, what are you doing listening to this podcast? But
we're very inclusive of people who don't like large crowds of people being chaotic and trivial.
Are we, though? I don't know. Any case, look at the link. There'll be one in the show notes. Register. I think we can guarantee this little shindig's going to sell out. So grab your ticket. Do not delay. Run, don't walk. Over to the link in the show notes for Chaos Trivia.
Chaos Trivia. Trivia that we should say, the trivia will be on the theme of energy and climate. And the other thing, if you have a team and want to put together a team and buy all those tickets, then that's A-OK. Mm-hmm. But there will also be efforts if you are a listener of Let Me Sum Up that perhaps doesn't have friends to go with that would be excited to go to this event. There will be efforts to put teams together, so we will not leave you lonely in the corner, not able to participate in the Chaos Trivia experience. So yes, check it out. Link in the show notes. We will love to see you there. We're also joined by a man with a roguish new cosplaying wig guaranteed to turn heads at a gaming convention near you. It is Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Why, hello there, Luke. And yes, I for my video game cosplay at PAX Australia 2025, I have a wizard robe, I have wizard boots, I have a wizard wig, and I have the 3D printed pieces of a wizard staff, which it is my task over the next few weekends to assemble together using flexible aluminium rods, a gap filler, a lot of sanding, a respirator, and an as yet unbought wealth of paint.
Right.
And that is, the wig is just the cherry on top of that extraordinary profusion of stuff. I might need to get some more use out of this wizard outfit. I might need to crack it out for Chaos Trivia. Who knows?
Right.
Oh, my God. Well, now that you voiced it, that's clearly happening. So if my little pitch earlier wasn't enough to get you along to Chaos Trivia, the prospective old wizard Tennant surely be temptation enough.
Well, this is just a down payment on the chaos that we promised in the name of the show.
Right.
It's just higher utilisation of capital investment.
On this week's show, we look at a new quarterly essay on the increasingly controversial and contested role of fossil gas exports in the Australian economy. But first, 2035 target speculation season is in full swing, and the attempts to influence the outcome are coming thick and fast, with the most recent intervention coming from the Business Council of Australia. Building on modelling they commissioned from McKinsey, the BCA effort doesn't land on a preferred number, instead highlighting the investment required to meet a 2035 target of 50%, 60% and 70% or more below 2005 levels. Frankie, we've all at least scanned this new BCA report, but it's landing in a particularly fevered context of target speculation. What's going on in target land? Where are we up to as we record?
Well, it's climate target modelling at 10 paces, clearly, at the moment. The BCA's latest effort is but one of a series of different modelling efforts out there, sort of backed by various outfits wanting to put forward their ideal kind of future and view of the world. And so we're really kind of getting down to crunch time now, right? So we record a bit earlier in the week. By the time you find folks are listening to this, we're probably, a week or less out from hearing what the 2035 target is going to be. At some point, I think also this would require a cabinet sign off as well, I think.
For sure.
So presumably that's happening. We should also not ignore the fact that the Climate Change Authority has also not formally, I think, provided its advice yet to government on what its recommendation for a target or a range would look like. And that is also imminent. So what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks is a series of things. We'll see an email press send from the CCA into government. I'm not going to speculate how long that email's been written for, but
you'd have to think that email has been sitting in the drafts folder for a while, getting edited now and then, and that the laptop has possibly been carried over physically to a meeting room for a "what would you think about this" kind of preview. But who knows?
Possibly. We certainly don't. But nonetheless, but that doesn't stop us speculating, clearly. But that advice will go formally to government. As I said, that will need to go in terms of the government's proposed response to that. We'll go to a cabinet meeting and decision, and then that number plus the accompanying commitments from the government need to go into our next nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, which, as I think we understand, would be certainly announced or foreshadowed at the upcoming UN General Assembly, which happens later on in September, and almost certainly does need to be lodged with the UNFCCC by the end of September if it's going to inform the big stocktake of NDC commitments that are being put forward by all the different parties to the Paris Agreement ahead of COP in Belém later this year. So that sort of time frame is what's, I think, driving the near-term release of the target. What else is going to come out with the target? Well, it's not just Target Christmas. It's like, I don't know if we're calling it Climate Christmas or Policy Palooza or whatever.
Climate Christmas is taken.
Yeah, that's true.
We need some other festival.
That's true.
We're pretty close to Halloween.
Chaos report season.
Chaos report.
But wait, there's more.
No, we're not going with climate chaos season. Anyway, so next week, presumably at some point, we'll see a target. We'll also likely see some treasury modelling that is helping underpin the government's overarching net zero plan, of which, the target is one element, but there's also a broader whole of economy modelling effort that's been going on for some time, led by the fine folks in Treasury. So we'll get to see that modelling. There'll be an overarching net zero plan, and there'll also be those 6 sectoral decarbonisation plans as well. And I think it's a fair bet to assume that pretty much all that stuff's going to be released around the same time. So there'll be an awful lot for people to sit back and absorb.
And you haven't even mentioned the adaptation bonus content.
No, I wouldn't put it as BOCO. I think that's underselling its importance.
It's a preview of coming attractions that we really don't want to go to the screening of that have no choice.
And that might be why I didn't mention it in that cohort, because I do think the release of that is likely to be slightly separate from it, and it would make sense that you would see. I think broadly the expectation has been for a little while now that the National Adaptation Plan and the Climate Risk Assessment would come out sometime beforehand. And, unlikely, there'll obviously be some challenging things in there for people to reckon with. But the idea is that that's not sitting there for too long before, there's an ambitious plan in response to what we need to do about it. And so into that mix, you've seen, other outfits, spruiking their own models. You've had the Business for 75 coalition, which has been supported by modelling from Deloitte, done a top-down analysis suggesting that a 75% target would deliver greater economic benefits for the economy overall than a 65% target. That being the start of the range that the CCA had broadly provided last year. But then you've also seen EY out there saying that between 65 and 75 could be eminently achievable with largely existing technologies, and focused on actually the stuff that we bang on about a lot, electrification, energy performance and things like that. But the modelling effort that seems to have garnered some more recent and focused attention is the stuff from the Business Council, which they commissioned McKinsey to do that work on. And it's also interesting to reflect on what's not in there and perhaps the reasons why that's the case. So there is no recommendation on a target number itself in the McKinsey modelling. Presumably that's a reflection on the fact that the Business Council's membership may not have been able to arrive, at a decision or a consensus view on what that looks like. And what it does look at, and I think Luke sort of mentioned this, is 3 scenarios of 50%, 60%, 70%, and an analysis of the costs that would be involved in achieving that target. It's very narrow in the things that it's considering in that modelling exercise. For one, that there's no modelling of the benefits involved. It's almost a very one-sided look at just the costs, and it's in my view misleading to look at only the costs involved. One critique you could level at this exercise in that they have costed a 50% scenario is that a lot of folks would say that our current trajectory would see us pretty much on path under BAU policies to achieve close to 50% reduction. And it's not really the done thing when you're looking at different cost-benefit analyses with policy to present the base case, if you like, as a costed option that's not presented, as a BAU.
Well, it's a bit tricky. It's a bit tricky because, this is comprehensively not a cost-benefit analysis. Those numbers are indicating the size of the new capex from now for the different scenarios to get various things done, you could view that as like useful information, or we need to attract, XDX billion dollars in this sector. What's going to be the basis of that? Are people going to feel comfortable to make that investment, this or that? You definitely couldn't take that number on its own and then say, therefore, this is the right number. This is the right target to pursue. And they haven't done that because you can't.
No. Which would be another reason why they might have fallen short from recommending a number on the basis of the analysis that's been put forward. I mean, there are, aside from, I really do think a rather significant failing of this work is the complete omission of benefits associated with any of the different pathways. There is one bit of this that is really tricky for me to kind of look at, because it obviously it's looking at capital expenditure, but I don't know if it's clear that it's the cost of replacing stuff at the end of life, like in addition to maintenance you would be doing. Like if it's excluding replacement costs, then it's largely going to be overestimating the cost of achieving those targets. It's like some of the assumptions that have gone into this report are really unclear on that basis, and like depending on the choice that they've made here, could lead to substantially overstated costs in some instances.
Well, I've got some thoughts on this report. This report has had a long gestation period. It's part of a whole context with the BCA having commissioned a few exercises of different sorts or authored a few reports of different sorts over the last 4 years, as part of getting, I would say, avoiding the kind of pit they found themselves in 2019, where they were sort of hostage to an exercise that the federal government was slowly going through around first trying to get itself to do something in electricity on the National Energy Guarantee, then a couple of years later working itself up to net zero. And in the process, I think, of trying to give some moral support to the then coalition government's efforts to incrementally approach more adequate climate policy, they wound up like slanging in pretty apocalyptic terms the then Labor opposition's medium-term emissions target. And so they've tried, I think, to get themselves over the last few years in a position where they had their own evidence base and their own set of documents and can be constructive on their own terms. But coming up with a number that you can hang your hat on is like a really hard exercise. It's hard enough for governments, and it's very hard for people with less resource than the government and a business organisation. You'd be surprised you, the listener, might be surprised how few resources they have to rub together on some of these things. This is a resource-intensive exercise that they've commissioned from McKinsey. It's taken a couple of years, and they've sort of gotten, after those couple of years, to we don't know what the right number is, but here's some general recommendations for how you should go about approaching them. And if you look at their insights and their recommendations, like, I don't think there's a non-sensible dot point in there. Like the bit that's offered for operation is like, I think it's fine. Some people have looked at this or the reporting around this and said this is a nefarious attempt to sap momentum, and like, I don't I don't think it is. There's a couple of things you could definitely have an interesting argument about, and the discussion we're going to have in the main paper section about the future of Australia's emissions-intensive exports of fossil fuels is super relevant here, because the closest this report gets to don't do a 70% target statement is in saying, well, one of the things that they did in their bottom-up assembly of ways to meet a 70% target was substantially scale back Australia's exports of thermal coal and maybe gas. It's a little ambiguous in the text whether they were doing anything on gas there, but at least thermal coal.
What's really hard, like there's a number of reasons why it's kind of really hard to properly interrogate this report without key assumptions being made available, and all of the usual gripes that the consumers of modelling will have around those kinds of things.
Boy, the food here is terrible, and such small portions.
But like it's also just looking at Australia very much in isolation of the globe. So it doesn't kind of consider or talk about or look at global actions that could occur over that time frame and how it impacts things like fossil fuel exports and mining activity, or even indeed how that impacts or influence and what the case is with Australia's GDP or population growth during that time. Like there's some really fundamental things that are just absent that would give better context for some of the stuff in here.
Yeah, but like if demand for Australia's thermal coal exports, and I would say like very plausibly we're going to see a decline in demand for our met coal exports and driven by economic changes inside China in particular. And gas, it's a bit more ambiguous, but there's a lot of competition and for gas supply, and I don't see a huge amount of growth happening despite all these various pledges by US trade partners to buy $11 billion more gas from them. That doesn't seem to actually be happening. If those exports shrink, the emissions associated with producing them within Australia will also shrink. That will be a wedge of stuff that makes a target easier to achieve. Like I think that's very clear. And the paper is taking a sort of if policy drives this, Australian domestic policy drives this shrinkage, then we'll have carbon leakage because emissions will show up elsewhere in the world from the fossil fuels still being produced somewhere else to go to the same customer. But if the demand just shrinks, then, we still have to deal with the economic consequences of a shrinkage of a major export industry, but global emissions will go down, and Australian emissions will go down, and we'll have some wind in the sails in achieving whatever the target number is. So, there's interesting arguments to be had about this stuff, but this is an important swing factor thing is totally fair.
It's interesting, right? I think this is the BCA playing a pretty straight bat, honestly. So you've got to remember this is a mob that was out and about in the 2019 election calling a 45% emissions reduction target by 2030 economy wrecking. I think they have been doing a lot of spade work to repair what many regarded as a pretty fundamental breach in their reputation as a credible player and participant in Australia's climate and energy debate after that performance, up to and including advocating for a 50% emissions reduction target at the 2022 election. I think that, exploring, the investment requirements associated with particular emissions reduction scenarios, given the diversity of their membership, is not a bad thing, and there's some pretty useful numbers in there. I think it underlines just how much money we're going to need to spend in these various scenarios. I also think it's possible to read between the lines, while they haven't explicitly said, 50% or 60% or 70% is right. If you actually read the thing, 50% is sort of BAU, 70%, geez, that looks hard. 60%, it's just right. Feels really comfortable. Like, we can do that. It's ambitious, but achievable. Like, there is, you know, a little bit of anchoring happening here, and I think you can see an implication of where the BCA thinks would be stretching the limits, but still able to actually be operationalised. The 70% scenario in the telling of this report is really, you know, pedal to the metal, with some of the bolts flying off the boiler as we kind of like we accelerate.
Climax of Back to the Future Part 3, possibly.
Yeah, that's right. The combustible logs have been thrown into the boiler. That colourful smoke is pouring out of the smokestack. The old-timey steam engine is barrelling towards, I don't know, Sheerness Ravine, or possibly a bright new future. Who's to say? The point is that there is, I think, an implied sort of comfortable range in this report. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I am the CEO of an organisation that has signed up to the movement that is calling for a 75% emissions reduction target, and does believe that, you know, that ambition will unlock all kinds of benefits for the Australian economy, and is something that we should absolutely be shooting for. But in the world of the various sort of interventions the Business Council of Australia could have made, this seems to me like relatively reserved, and demonstrates just how far the debate has moved on over the last 5 or 6 years, honestly.
I think that's a fair call. I do think that in addition to the export, like, just we're going to have modelling coming out of our ears soon with the next wedge of Treasury stuff, and the next wedge of Treasury stuff will settle precisely as many arguments as the last few go-rounds of Treasury modelling have, which is zero. Worthy effort, I'll eat it up. But nobody who thinks this is all a bad idea will be persuaded one way or the other by another modelling report. As well as that, what happens to exports of coal and gas swing factor. The other two things that modelling tends to have a hard time with: innovation, our old friend, what does happen to abatement costs and alternative solutions and stuff on the demand side in response to price changes, and just things that rarely is there a satisfying little computer person simulation of the world happening in these modelling exercises. In fact, you open up the hood and you find that there's just a forced assumption that this is the cost of doing X in year Y. And reality is more dynamic than that. So innovation can help further. Innovation can go more slowly than we hoped. If there's less deployment overseas of some of the technologies that we want to see, there's going to be, like, pretty clearly less deployment of hydrogen electrolysis over the next decade globally than people might have thought like 5 years ago. There won't be none, but there will be less, and there's going to be less cost reduction, very likely, in that area than we thought. But there's going to be a lot more in anything you can do with batteries. Batteries are just going bananas. And they're going into niches we didn't expect. They're doing all kinds of things. The amount of gas that we need to back up renewables in the electricity system is not going to zero anytime soon. But the amount of daily variability that is going to be handled by batteries is a lot bigger than we would have thought not so long ago. So that's a big thing. And then the third thing is, what does happen with the land sector and the land sink? One of the key assumptions in the BCA work is, well, we're already at a high point in the net sink that we're getting from the land sector. And in the three scenarios, we either, like in the most ambitious scenario, we stay at the current balance. And in the other two, we go backwards. We have a smaller land sink. Now, it is true that it is hard work to keep restraining land clearing and keep promoting reforestation or other means of building up carbon in the land, especially with rising temperatures and some areas of the country getting drier. The risk of fires, like the average amount of carbon storage in land declining. But we do have a bunch of people who think no, there is more that we can do on the land side, and certainly where we get to there will have a big impact.
Well, that's going to require its own innovation as well, right? Because you've got a suite of methods that are currently used to generate ACCUs, and some of the future territory we're going to have to look at may well and should sort of be beyond that. I mean, I think that again, it's a useful thing that this and frankly a lot of the other modelling exercises that have been out there lately have done, which is highlighting that, post 2030, we are going to need to start looking beyond energy and electricity, and there's an awful lot of complexity in those sectors that that we've been ignoring for a long time. And as this podcast, if we'd had a mission over the last little while to draw attention to some of where those opportunities are in the last little while, and that ain't going to happen overnight either, whether your model tells you it can or not.
The Let Me Sum Up podcast into non-electricity decarbonisation before it was cool.
Yeah. Oh, there's a T-shirt. Oh, dear.
Shall we chat about our report?
Yeah.
An essay, even.
Shortly after its May election victory, the Albanese government approved a conditional extension to the life of Woodside Energy's North West Shelf gas plant to 2070. The decision was welcomed by Woodside and the Western Australian government, who argue fossil gas is a critical transition fuel for our region. However, it was lambasted by environmental advocates, who questioned the extension given the urgent need for the world to accelerate efforts to hit net zero emissions by 2050. This fracas is just the latest in a very long line of controversies associated with Woodside Energy, a history that is skillfully chronicled by Marianne Wilkinson in the latest quarterly essay, Woodside versus the Planet: How a Company Captured a Country. In it, she traces Woodside's origins back to the 1960s, catalogues the crucial role that government patronage has played in the company's success, and interrogates the cognitive dissonance required of corporations and governments that profess a commitment to climate action while spruiking the continued extraction of fossil fuels for decades to come. Tennant, I found the backstory laid out in this quarterly essay pretty fascinating. What did you make of it?
So, once I got over wanting this essay to be something other than what it was, I really liked 95% of it. I kept thinking it might turn into what I wanted it to be, and it never did. I'm a policy guy, and I wanted an essay that was going to really grapple with policy questions, really wrestle with them. Even if I didn't like the answers it was going to give, I thought those were going to be fascinating questions. And they remain fascinating questions, but they are only provoked, not grappled with really, by this essay, which is, I think, a nuanced and a skillful work of reportage. It is here is a bunch of things that happened and the backstory to them and the nuances of who said what, and covering events up to the minute. I don't know exactly when it was pens down from the invigilators at Quarterly Essay Enterprises, but there were things here that we covered a few episodes back around the International Court of Justice decision on duty duties of governments around climate change. And there's stuff that is, as you said, Luke, stretching back to the 1960s, a lot of things in the 1980s. I think this is a really well worth reading essay to understand some of the omnipresence of Woodside in particular and Australia's gas industry more broadly in not just in the politics of climate and energy, but in the broader political economic system, in culture and society, the level of being at the heart of everything that Woodside has, and Kerry Stokes separately has in Perth and in West Australian society is like, it's very great. It's like all that stuff was good, and I learnt a bunch of things, including like there is a good, I didn't agree with everything in it, but a good session about the recent controversy over the protection of priceless cultural heritage of petroglyphs of Indigenous rock art up to 50,000 years old, very close to the Northwest Shelf projects onshore, the LNG liquefaction plant at Karratha and the other industrial developments there. The recent controversy over the impact of all those developments on the art through noxious emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, and what that might do in the future. I was familiar with that already. I'd already looked at the infamous, or is it consultant report on what these emissions had been over time and the impact they would have over time. The thing I was unaware of here was the first go-around at industrial impact on the petroglyphs, which was in the early 1980s, when, forget the question of industrial emissions, a bunch of the petroglyphs were just bulldozed into pebbles by the developers with the approval of the Western Australian and federal governments, following a couple of days to a week tops, I think, of desperate archaeological efforts to photograph what couldn't be moved and move what could be.
And without the involvement and consultation of the traditional custodians in the area.
Forbidden to talk to them, which was like weirdo government policy at the time. Crazy pants. And I think the kind of like reckless, wanton destruction that in the service of getting a big thing done, that the abundance curious, including me, should like think very carefully about before getting too deregulatory today, because like some pretty atrociously bad stuff happened in the past.
Appalling.
I thought, I mean, were you two amused / horrified by the shenanigans also recounted around the near collapse of the project and a sweetheart tax and royalties deal that we're still living with the consequences of today to bail them out?
Yeah, I was horrified. Was I surprised? Probably not, because I think that would have been the experience of traditional custodians, not just on that project in WA, but a lot more broadly at that time. Like, I think that conversation has evolved quite a lot. But what I do think is that it contextualizes the contemporary response to some of these companies' efforts as well.
Yes.
To the extent that there is trust or there is not trust for the intentions of these companies. I finished reading it, and the thing that I sort of thought, what would I say to anyone who hadn't read it yet? I think I could sum it up as concisely as, if you don't live in WA, you'll learn a lot about the landscape there.
Yeah.
And I think just what the essay renders so skillfully, and it is really well written and done with a lot of nuance and sensitivity, is really just kind of paint a picture for someone who isn't a local of the enduring kind of influence and kind of omniscience of a big company like Woodside in that state. And I think a lot of the way that, maybe this is represented in kind of current reporting is their projects like Northwest Shelf and things like that have a very partisan lens over it, like climate, anti-climate, etc. But there's actually been, like, the thing that was just sort of so abundantly clear through reading of this is that both sides of politics in WA have been on a unity ticket when it comes to the role of big gas in that economy. And in it, it's sort of visible at levels, as kind of grassroots as the, sponsorship of kids' sports teams and nippers outfits and things like that, up to professional sporting teams and corporate sponsorships of things. Like, they really are just everywhere and have done a lot of work over a very long period of time to build that community standing. And I think what the author cautions as well is that you shouldn't assume that doesn't have quite a lot of support, in that state and locally, and people who call up the the role that they've played in supporting the WA economy. So, for someone who sits on the other side of the country and resonates maybe more strongly with the characterization of projects like Northwest Shelf as climate bombs, it's fascinating and an interesting context to be given.
Yeah, look, it's incredibly readable, and I had a very enjoyable Sunday afternoon with this quarterly essay. I knew quite a lot of the policy and at the high level, I guess, economic and energy market dynamics that it was describing. What it really brought through was the personalities and the different kind of factions in the conversation and the debate. And your word, Tennant, is perfect reportage. So you sort of get into the heads of, the key personalities from Woodside, the chair Richard Goyder and the CEO Meg O'Neill. You get into the heads of kind of a largely interchangeable cavalcade of WA premiers from both sides of politics, notably Messrs. Barnett, McGowan and Cook, who all broadly think that Woodside's great and gas is great and exporting gas to our region is even better, and just let's keep the gravy train rolling. You have some really affecting sort of interactions over the course of this quarterly essay with some of the Indigenous custodians of this area. People like Raylene Cooper, who's a former chair of the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, who has a really interesting relationship with this topic as someone that was formerly part of the governance associated with the custodianship of this land, but has ultimately broken with that formal governance to wage a campaign against Woodside, and indeed sort of getting under the hood of the position that corporation finds itself in as a organisation that is charged with that custodianship, but derives the vast bulk of its income from the industrial projects on that site, and
is very conscious of how little power they have.
Yep. And then also the environmental activists that have really kind of like activated around this topic over the last several years. And I think this essay really demonstrates have massively raised the profile and problematised the role of Woodside in WA. I think one could draw the conclusion from this essay they've been much more successful in problematising it on the East Coast than the West Coast.
Yeah.
And I think your point is exactly right, Frankie. I think this essay really cautions against us East Coasters thinking that, you know, people in WA are as concerned about this issue as many of the people that we interact here on the East Coast on the daily might be. But it sort of lands in the right place, which is like sort of grappling this role of gas as a transition fuel, the idea that it is going to always be better to be exporting gas to countries in our region that are currently relying on coal because gas is lower emissions. And that is an argument that is made and repeated again and again by corporations that stand to directly benefit from the export of that gas, and indeed governments that are aligned with that view. And it's really problematic because it is lower emissions, but the latest evidence cited in this report suggests, well, maybe it's, you know, 75% of the emissions of coal, and you look at the global studies, and often the IEA is cited, and it's cited again in this context. Keeping global warming within a safe range implies no new fossil fuel fields are opened up. Right.
With some asterisks on what is new.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And I think that's relevant. And, you know, we need to get into the detail of all that. But the fairly starry-eyed kind of rhetoric from commercial interests and governments that have bought the line of commercial interests that this is, you know, completely unproblematic and doesn't need to be grappled with, and indeed, you know, even attempting to grapple with it is hugely inappropriate and naive. This quality essay succeeds in shining a great big spotlight on it. But I agree with you, Tennant. It doesn't then go and say, well, what do we do with that?
Yeah. And there's something else that's arguably not completely unproblematic and arguably does need to be grappled with, which this essay made me think about constantly, but it did not itself grapple with it, which is some of the people at the heart of a big chunk of this essay are the campaigners who were under the rubric of Disrupt Burrup Hub, and will be like those individuals or other people with a very similar outlook will be going on to the next fight, having, it would appear, comprehensively lost the direct fight over the extension of the Northwest Shelf project and the regassing of that with new fields. They're going to next push against the Browse Basin development, which has a vast amount of potentially producible gas. They're going to push back against that, and rather than focus on local environmental impacts on petroglyphs, this time they will be focusing on local environmental impacts on a nearby reef.
Scott Reef.
Yeah. And the question that is not grappled with at any point, which we could controversially spend the next half an hour or maybe 1,000 years arguing about, is a supply constriction-oriented campaign strategy actually a productive thing and a good idea? Because there's people picking anti-charismatic mega projects to say, we say no, we say stop. Don't do this. Let's deploy monkey wrenching. Let's deploy the memes. Let's go and blow whistles in meetings. Let's do all the things to stop this supply project. The question that needs to be grappled with is, does that actually achieve anything? And grumpy Grinches like me are going to say, no, it doesn't. Beyond activating some people who feel very strongly to campaign against and activating a bunch of other people who feel very strongly to say don't interfere with my region's livelihood. And governments run a mile, or in fact, like, call in the police and lock up the disruptors for a bit anyway. But like the bulk of the people in WA or Queensland hate this kind of thing. The people in the immediate regions hate it. It's electoral poison for parties of government to be seen to be nodding to it. The trade partners hate it. The battles keep getting lost, or when they're won, that doesn't seem like a permanent victory. So is there an alternative to that is like anything at all is a question. But like, does that work? And this, I wanted like a chapter about that, and I didn't get it.
You should write in to the response column, Tenant, to the next quarterly essay.
If they would run a little picture of me in my wizard costume to add to the credibility of that intervention, maybe I will.
You won't know until you try, Tenant.
It's true. It's true.
So I think Woodside is a particular figure in this debate. I think that's worth kind of spending a bit of time talking about, right? Because I think we've all touched on the way through this narrative that is problematic and does need to be reckoned with around the role of gas in the long term, and the preferred narrative or position from fossil fuel companies like Woodside, which is that it's an essential transition fuel for our trading partners to reduce their reliance on coal, and that we should we should allow and support the transition from coal to gas, presumably to renewables. I think on one level you could engage with that kind of messaging and argument in somewhat good faith if the actor that's pushing that narrative has credible plans in place of their own to transition and to deal with the longer term emissions implications from their activities. But I think one of the other interesting bits of reportage in this essay is the fact that Woodside has had quite a lot of activism around its general meetings over the last couple of years in response to like those very plans, right? Like activist shareholders that have been relatively successful in some instances in challenging the credibility of their corporate transition plans on this stuff. And so it sort of goes to, there needs to be an element of reality injected into the domestic conversation around the role of gas. So it's that, I think we were talking about it at the top of the episode with like amazing kind of cost reduction and expanded kind of use cases of batteries, say, eating into the share of what fossil gas will do in the power sector, for example, into the future. Like that needs to be reckoned with. But, we also need to kind of work with our trade partners. And I think this is where it comes to is the supply side constriction thing really going to work if we're not presenting, the alternative future, which is where the whole movement around renewable energy superpower and, green commodities and things like that is trying to aim. And it's sort of shifting, the possible future for a state like WA, which is very minerals and resources rich and absolutely could conceivably be the very heart of that movement. But you don't really see Woodside, sort of stepping into that role in looking at the future beyond fossil gas. Because if we are to achieve net zero in 2050, we do need to substantially decline the use of fossil gas in a range of applications. And at the moment, I just don't think it's realistic or, productive to just be invoking energy security and things like that and just sort of putting a wall up in the discussion around where the use cases of that exported fossil gas is currently versus where it might go. Like there's no acknowledgement really or discussion around the declining demand for that gas into the future.
I mean, we're at a really interesting moment in terms of fossil fuel companies, or predominantly fossil fuel companies, flip-flopping on their interest in being part of the transition versus, getting on the bandwagon, particularly in light of the recent election of the Trump administration. The evidence to date is that these organisations, notwithstanding moments of clarity and, saying the right things, find it pretty hard to stay the course and to wean themselves off the good stuff that's still making the money. And, sitting there counting the beans, they reckon that it'll continue making the money for some time to come. So it's interesting in the context of this particular essay. It has a laser-like focus on Woodside. And while it references Exxon a little bit, broadly in the context of Meg O'Neill being an Exxon executive, there is no comparative analysis. It's not considering what's Woodside like on these issues relative to some of its peers internationally. I think that would be an interesting analysis to do.
But I think the point of focusing on them is that, I think they are the exception or the extreme case in the domestic context, because compared to, other resources companies that are Australian based and things like that, they are very deliberately and clearly making a big bet on continued gas or increasing gas demand into the future rather than declining.
Oh, look, I think that this, had this essay tried to do more than it's trying to do in terms of kind of having a bigger conversation about the role of fossil fuel companies, it would have been less compelling. The story would have been diluted. Its strength is it focuses on a single company in a single state and the ecosystem that is created in that context. Going back to your question, Tennant, I kind of think, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this in the past, so I'm gonna perhaps critique myself at the same time I'm critiquing you. I think people in the centre telling more radical elements of the movement that their activism is unhelpful is itself pretty unhelpful. Because I don't think that they'll listen, and B,
there's one or two who do listen to this podcast. And well, they were up until about 5 minutes ago.
Well, maybe they'll listen and they may consider. I don't know that they'll necessarily change their views, or maybe they will. Maybe that is in itself unfair. But I think my point is broadly that there will always be radical elements of the movement that do keenly feel the existential nature of these issues, and sort of circuitous, slow-moving policy debates are not going to satisfy them. And I think that is a reasonable response to the moment we find ourselves in. And I do think there is a social license piece to all of this that does get influenced over time by this sort of action. And we've seen that again in terms of social movements, right? So while it might not seem to be really moving the needle at all in the space of 6, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, over time, public opinion can flip. And, that groundwork can seem pretty thankless early on, but it can bear fruit over time. The other argument for actually attempting these sorts of interventions is that once these investments get made, capital is sunk, constituencies are created, communities are built around this infrastructure, and then it is incredibly hard to shift. And so there is an argument for trying to avoid, extending that infrastructure, extending that investment of local communities in investments that are fundamentally incompatible with the economy that we're trying to move towards. Now, there is a debate to be had about the degree to which you're simply creating a backlash, and are there other pathways that are more fruitful. I tend to agree with your point, Frankie, which is that While that conversation is happening on the ground, like there is a power of work that needs to be done in terms of working with our trading partners on that collaborative decarbonisation, on kind of finding those win-win scenarios where we can support their decarbonisation efforts while decarbonising our own economy. But I don't think those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive, and to some degree one might create some space for the other.
I think that's right. And the other really interesting question that arises from this, and it goes to the point you just made there, Luke, around the sunk cost of new infrastructure and investment in gas, which kind of, it guarantees almost a lifespan of its use then at that point, which is, speaking frankly, the very bet that companies like Woodside are making to underpin a lot of the advocacy that they do. There is a bit of a numbers exercise to do then when it comes to, if we're sticking with that line on wanting to support our trading partners to decarbonise in the most efficient way possible. I just think it would be a really interesting intellectual exercise to think about what would the emissions, like the sort of different emissions profiles attached to a slightly longer use of coal to a leapfrog over gas and more renewables uptake in, particular use cases and things like that, rather than, buying in, no questions asked, to the gas is the transition fuel of choice. Because whilst it is, less emissions than coal, it's not substantially less emissions than coal. And it would be a really interesting exercise to see if there is that possibility of, in some markets, the leapfrog thing where, like in a few years, batteries are going to be again, so significantly, cheaper than they are currently. Just what those two couple of different futures might look like. And if we were claiming to be a responsible actor, kind of thinking about the ways in which we can support that global decarbonisation faster.
There is a constant struggle to maintain some nuance in this debate because the people on the pro-gas, like the real core of the pro-gas side, they are just bought in on gas, and reach for anything. To any ambiguity or crack of opportunity will be taken to say, and that's why we need gas.
It's the LNG ships named Gassy McGasface.
Oh, I love it. But there are also people who have decided that gas must end, and that is a simple heuristic that represents a lot of judgments about they're not going to be serious, they're going to overproduce, and you can't give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So no, just say no to gas. And those people will, who everybody is the hero of their own story, but those people will reach for whatever arguments or tools they can find. And it's just hard and maybe doomed to try and go, well, actually, to everybody at once and say, but I'm that kind of doomed person. Gas is modestly better than coal on a life cycle basis. Done well and done badly, it's pretty badly, but done badly, coal's pretty even worse than what we're assuming. But if you do a version of Eastern Australia's integrated system plan in any given country that's got a decent amount of space and renewable resources, you will be at the same time cutting your electricity sector reliance on coal and gas very deeply in absolute terms, and bringing on a chunk of gas-fired capacity to be there as occasional backup. And the volume of gas is not large, compared to like the US style switch bulk energy from coal to gas. But it is significant and enduring until such time as we have a different solution to batteries. And like that's like, what is that? That is not no gas. That is not endless growth of the gas industry. That's deep contraction of the gas industry, at least on the electricity sector side of things, but contraction to a point that is still like quite substantial. Plus, you've got industrial uses that people argue about. Plus, you've got the sort of the tail of heating uses. It's just unsatisfying. And so I think there's some activists quoted in this piece who have some extremely sensible things to say while, being very grumpy with Woodside. I think like Alex Hillman, who I know and I think is a lovely guy, used to work for Woodside famously in sort of energy land, left and became an anti-Woodside campaigner. And like he's got some points in here about needing to front up about the inevitable long-term decline in demand for gas overall if we're going to come within any approach to net zero emissions at any point. Yeah. So, like, I think that is fine to campaign on. I just think that the yank supply away, is not going to work. And the people, the campaigners here are primarily talking about slowing or stopping like long-term supply, not flicking a switch overnight and saying no more gas for you. They're not trying to do something like that. But we have seen the impact of a very sudden shift in the last few years, which was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the impacts that had on global gas markets. That sudden withdrawal created higher prices, which created higher profits for the gas industry, which meant more investment in supply and a lot of grumpiness about that from energy users. Some of that grumpiness mistakenly attributed to renewables, which is a very dangerous environment. Now, that's not the kind of shock that anti-gas campaigners are trying to create. They want a slower thing. But we've seen like the shock version creates, yes, some new investment in clean energy, but yes, some new investment in gas. The slow version just gives plenty of time for people who are still on the demand side, are still built around the use of gas to find someone else to sell them the gas. And the drug dealer defense, as that sort of line-up argument is often called, whatever its moral qualities, has the virtue of absolute factual correctness. Somebody else is going to sell that gas unless the demand goes away. And so focusing on undermining, white-anting, substituting the demand for gas with demand for clean energy is like a very productive thing to do. But by all means, tell bloviators you're full of it. This is not going to be an endlessly growing industry. This is an industry with a very long yet hot winter in front of it as demand inevitably shrinks.
It sounds like you're setting up a little bit of a binary there, though, that, that we should be focusing on removing the demand.
We have a choice between false binaries and nuance.
Yes. So we need to focus on shifting demand for gas, for fossil fuels to cleaner alternatives. But, like those issues that I was describing around kind of, we've just been talking about how much capital needs to go into the clean economy to make the transition. Yep. Like capital isn't endless. Like capital that's going into fossil fuel investments can't go into other places. You are creating constituencies which become very attached to that infrastructure because it's supporting jobs and, there's obviously people that are making a decent amount of cash out of those that infrastructure, vested interests that, as this essay ably demonstrates, can have an outside influence on government decisions and the interests in those governments in kind of forging these sorts of alliances around collaborative decarbonisation that I'm describing. Like, yeah, I'm sort of saying, well, is there a world in which, you know, there is an appropriate focus on both supply and demand, like thinking in a more nuanced way about, like, you know, what should we be targeting in terms of an envelope for the availability of gas on a net zero trajectory? I mean, I know this is incredibly hard politically, and I think to date, like, I only know of one country that's actually, you know, actively halted fossil fuel exports on the basis of, you know, wanting to sort of drive a transition. Colombia, you know, a very fossil fuel dependent economy, famously announced a couple of years ago that it was going to halt fossil fuel exploration. That was incredibly controversial, and I remember it. I think it was COP28.
28. Yep.
Yeah. You know, the representative for Colombia spoke very passionately about, you know, them leading the charge, but also the impact that was having on their economy through the reaction of global capital markets to Colombia's decision to kind of make that shift away from fossil fuel income. Like, it's a vexed space, but I don't know that there is nothing there to be done at all on the supply side of the element, that you can just say, well, we've got to focus on demand and we'll just keep approving these new fossil fuel projects. As long as people are putting them up, we'll just keep, you know, waving them through while we focus on the demand side.
I don't know if I'm like the activist friend in this pod or something, but I think
Have you been convinced?
No, every actor has their role to play in trying to push the conversation along, and I just think that individual project approvals are more easily or readily understood if there isn't this complete cognitive dissonance between where we need to get to and the policy plans that we currently have and the way our governments talk about gas. So, the other thing that I would say, and I was really keen to circle back to the ICJ of it all, because this feels like a prime sort of area that might be looked at here. It is, you know, it just is weird that our environmental laws don't consider the thing that is having the largest cumulative impact on the environment in the long term. And I know, so, which is EPBC Act not considering climate impacts, but again, that is more readily understood if you have a really comprehensive, you know, policy framework in place to regulate the decline of those emissions. And so, you know, inevitably you end up in this conversation around, is the safeguard, you know, doing the job that it needs to do in those companies. So from that perspective, I can completely understand the cynicism, the perspective of those activists when people just point and say, well, there's a safeguard, when currently, you know, a lot of the emissions abatement companies like Woodside are pursuing in the near term is the purchase of offsets and not investing in enough on-site decarbonisation. Like, all those things together don't add up to social license in my view. And so I don't know if I'm just that sort of annoying person in this chat that's sort of suggesting there's a role for both, but I do think there's a role for both. I think there's a separate point around whether the particular tactics of the activists in WA are being effective in that state with that population, because we talked about, the kind of outsized role and presence that the company has, in that population and with the politics. But there is absolutely a role for activists to highlight the long run environmental impacts of these projects, because we're like, at some point we are going to have to reckon with this, and we can't get there, without more provocateurs on that side making the case for it. I don't think sensible centrism gets us to the conversation we need to have about gas fast enough, is maybe my view.
I'm tempted to be a different provocateur. I will say one extra thing, and it connects to the point of the argument about the supply interdiction, which is, in the course of raising concerns about fossil fuel supply projects, principally on climate grounds, campaigners tend to highlight very real, local, environmental or cultural or social impacts of these projects. And there's really moving stuff in this paper about the Murujuga cultural heritage, the various Aboriginal peoples who care for that land, and the feelings from very mixed feelings to outright opposition that those people have about the disruption of these industrial developments. There are going to be a lot of local environmental, social and cultural impacts that can potentially be created by low and zero emissions developments. And not so many pages after the essay speaks movingly about the experience of local peoples, it approvingly, excitedly, notes in China's renewables development, the solar Great Wall in the Kabuki Desert, which will eventually cover an area some 400 kilometres long and 5 kilometres wide when completed in 2030, with a capacity more than all of America's 54 commercial nuclear power plants. I don't know, but I would guess that there is some local cultural heritage or local environmental impact at stake in a 400 kilometre long, 5 kilometre wide solar project. I know nothing about the trade-offs involved. Generically, I think that those trade-offs are worth making. But if we tie ourselves to a primacy of local impacts in order to stop one kind of project that we don't like, we may find that we are also preventing other projects that we do like within a legal system that needs to be even-handed. And if you provide a tool to monkey wrench some stuff, you may find that other things get killed too, because there are people who are taking some real and some made up fears about renewables projects right now to try and kill a lot of them. So be careful what you wish for. Also, the sequel needs to be written to this that gets to the issue of who was the mole in Disrupt Burrup Hub that was feeding all their plans to the police. That's a thread that needs to get pulled.
I think that should be the subject of a limited run thriller podcast. Burrup Confidential. As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I've got a very exciting international policy development to substantially decrease demand for fossil fuels. A wonderful demand-side policy intervention of the sort we need to see so much more. which is the International Maritime Organization, which governs global shipping, is soon to vote on a slightly complicated but very ambitious carbon pricing scheme that will, if adopted, and in the IMO, like if there's anybody from the UNFCCC listening, get ready for this. In the IMO, they have votes on whether to do things. And if a majority says, yes, we will do the thing, they do the thing.
That's crazy pants.
I don't know.
What is this multilateral innovation?
What?
Extraordinary technology, but they are voting on a scheme that would set declining emissions intensities for global shipping. And if you're above the intensity, you pay a carbon price. And if you're really above that intensity, you pay a much higher carbon price. And if you're below the intensity by enough, you get carbon price revenue thrown at you. And the effect of this is likely to substantially decrease global demand for heavy fuel oil over the next couple of decades. And I mean, it might increase demand in the short term for LNG as a cleaner fuel than heavy fuel oil. The heavy fuel oil is like, it's pretty bad. But ammonia, green methanol, maybe green hydrogen directly, are likely to be big winners should this get up. Now, what I hear on the grapevine is that it is going to get up, but the United States is actively campaigning against it. They're saying people who vote for it will get slapped with tariffs and higher port fees and, I don't know, angry tweets. The word on the street is the US is a bit of a joke on this subject and nobody's going to listen, but we'll see. Global shipping, pretty important. And creating demand for low and zero emissions fuels, pretty important. So, yay, IMO?
In my opinion. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I've got a little PSA for a launch that maybe flew a little under the radar last week. That was Treasury's investor front door, officially open for business. So for those that, I don't know, aren't regularly trolling Treasury's website to see what new web pages have got up and been launched, the Treasury front door was conceived as part of the Future Made in Australia package. And so the idea of it is to help kind of be a bit of a concierge service to projects that are obviously kind of fall within that definition of Future Made in Australia, which is pretty broad because there's obviously, you know, the kind of the climate imperative and there's the security kind of lens that you can put over that. But largely, you know, really important projects, you know, we should all be getting behind and kind of help do a bit of hand-holding through different regulatory, you know, approvals between different levels of government, also acting as a bit of an intro or broker to different special investment vehicles that exist, you know, across the government. You got National Reconstruction Fund, CFC, ARENA, etc., which all on the surface of it is very positive and good. My little word of caution, I think, and it kind of goes to the abundance of it all in the conversation we've been having. I think we just need to be really clear in standing up new initiatives like this, which aim to be helpful and grease the wheels and reduce cost and complexity. That we're making sure that those additional initiatives of government like are in fact going to do that and not going to duplicate, you know, other processes that already exist. The one that comes to mind that's sort of being bandied about at the moment is the Productivity Commission's suggestions on speeding up environmental approvals with the strike team on renewables and things like that. So, yeah, I just sort of in my head am going, how are these things going to work together? And
the strike team goes through the front door.
Let's please avoid multiple additional layers of helpful bureaucracy that end up adding time and cost. And so I think hopefully a really good thing, and it'll be fascinating to watch the implementation, but nice to see that sort of finally launch out. And I guess we'll see over the next couple of months what projects they're working with.
All right. Very briefly for my one more thing, I, unusually for me, was forced to pick up a hard copy edition of the quarterly essay. As long-time listeners will know, I'm a big fan of the audio editions of these quarterly essays that show up on Audible, but it wasn't up in time for us recording. So I schlepped it into a newsagent, and actually I was pretty pleased to hand over some hard-earned to that increasingly diminishing part of the Australian economy. Anyway, the point of this Shaggy Dog story is that I picked up another similarly sized periodical that was sitting next to it, the latest edition of Foreign Affairs, which sort of reads like this is a collection of essays, as is, the habit of Foreign Affairs on a theme. And this is like it was written in response to a variety of segments that the Let Me Sum Up podcast has done in the last several episodes. We've got an essay on US-China tech competition and the challenges it poses for Australia.
Nice.
We've got an essay on the contest for dominance in critical minerals. We've got an essay on the danger posed by persuasive technologies, read AI. And there's also an essay on Australia sharing decision-making on initiatives impacting Pacific nations. So if you're interested in any of that, and I, as listeners will not be shocked to hear, I'm interested in all of that. The issue 24, June 2025 edition of Foreign Affairs. It's got a bright yellow cover. I'm making my way through it. It's pretty good so far. I commend it to you. All right, we are almost done. But every fortnight after the show, we record a bonus episode called There Is Too Much, in which we find the lever on the recliner, pop back the seat, sink into that soft, sumptuous velvet, and cover something we didn't have time for on the main show, or indeed something which we did cover on the main show, but we know there's more to it, or indeed more opinions that could be brought to the table. Tennant, what are we covering on this fortnight's episode of There Is Too Much?
We're going to get some choice insights from inside the Western Australian Woodside complex.
From joining the Let Me Sum Up podcast.
Okay, not quite that far inside, but inside enough. Like from a West Australian who's pretty involved in local climate and energy debate, as well as national and global climate and energy debate. It will be the superest of super Summerupperers, Kylie Turner, having a chat with us and telling us what we really don't understand about the far side of this great nation, Australia. What an Eastocentric statement that was.
So I reckon that'll be a good chaser to the conversation we just had. Run, don't walk to letmesumup.net. Click on Support LMSU on the top of the page. You'll be able to find your way to our Patreon. Support the pod for the low price of $10 a month and access that and all the other sweet Boko. All right, that is our show for today. This podcast was edited by energy professional and podcast tragic Mark Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, you like promoting things.
I do.
What are you going to promote today?
I I am going to issue another clarion call for tickets to Chaos Trivia. And you can find, presumably, that also by going to our website. There's a blog on there. Who knew? We
a secret
have only
blog that has just been activated.
That's right. But by the time you're listening to this, there'll be a post up there with a link to where you can buy tickets to Chaos Trivia and come along and support the First Nations Clean Energy Network and partake of Tennant being dressed as a wizard and all of the other crazy shit that's going to happen.
All going
at
well.
at this trivia event in October.
Definitely the reason to come to check out Tennant's cosplay. Can't wait for that. But in the meantime, for Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.